Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. So you typed, where did it all go then? Maybe the silverware, grow or Wayne's Ah? With a wicked sneer, asked the restaurant manager Atlas. The alleged thief stood before him, green eyes, sparkling with indignation, plump lips, trembling on high cheekbones, blazing crimson blush. But not fear. Fear of a desperate longing to whitewash herself before her superiors. In short, Adriana was gone. Michael was not accustomed to having the staff of his establishment in front of him exactly that awe. I didn't take anything. When I got to the ballroom, they weren't on the table. The small banquet hall, which that day was supposed to host expensive guests, a few wives of businessmen who wished to have an elegant lunch of gossip and delicacies, was almost ready. Fresh exotic flowers in fancy broken vases, elaborate menus featuring molecular cuisine. Live music awaited a cellist. The Gostiny porcelain dishes were already arranged. And then we discovered that the silver cutlery was nowhere to be found. They were expensive pieces, and Michael immediately realized that someone from the servants had decided to get rich. It's an outrage to steal past the kitchen. Only last week, the guard routinely, checking bags on the way out of the shift, found the cook only meat and clippings. Galena, of course, as she did not forget that it was for the children. So because her husband has no loans to feed them. From work kicked out with a corresponding entry in the employment record. But rottenness, it seems, thoroughly penetrated the team. And she was supposed to pick them up at the car wash, Michael said. So that's the last time she saw them. I'm telling you, I didn't take anything and left them here. The waitress waved her hand toward the massive buffet. The problem was that two other waitresses had entered the room after her, and they hadn't found the appliance. But there was no point in suspecting them, because when those two girls came into the room, other people also came in. Semyon, for example, who had to check the light bulb that had suddenly started flashing. And somehow it was doubtful that 5 people from the staff decided to get silverware. We've already checked your locker, Michael said. That leaves us with one last option. Get undressed. The banquet hall had been quiet before. The staff had been staunchly behind the angry chef's back. And now it seemed you could hear the heartbeat of the intended victim. Michael sounded the timid voice of Rick. The boy was working Ethan. How can you do that? Can you do that? Yes, you can. Grimly sealed the chief and returned menacing as a pot. Attention, Adriana. Maybe you hid an apron in your pocket or under your skirt, a bag hanging, and in it stolen all sorts of tricks people invent to take out someone else's stuff. What do you say from personal experience? The waitress threw off her chin. The banquet hall was silent again, but now it was of a different kind. The kind that happens when a thunderstorm is about to break out, maybe even a tornado storm. What did you say? The chief couldn't believe his ears. You're out of your mind. I'll have you out of here. And nowhere else in the city in the catering you will not take even the floor of the garbage. But first you're out, then you're out. The staff, waitresses, baristas, and even the cook, Emilian, all held their breath. If Michael could read minds, he would have realized that they were ready to make a bet. That now Adriana would spit in his face and turn around and just proudly walk away, informing him beforehand that he had no right to abuse a man like that. So you want me to undress? The girl asked in a strange tone. Okay, I undressed, and she pulled the ties of the front from her uniform. The waitress uniform in satin consisted of a black pencil skirt, white blouse, vest, and a black same apron with a pocket where the girls carried a pad and pencil to record orders. Ideally, of course, they should have memorized the orders, but in practice, especially with the influx of visitors, this was much more convenient. Well, Check hissed at her with tape. The apron went on a short flight into Michael's hands. He caught it instinctively, but didn't even check it right away, because he was only rounding his eyes now, because he hadn't expected the girl to take off her clothes. He just wanted to scare her properly to teach her a lesson, so that she would cry, start to justify, beg, defend herself. It was just a chance to put this Adriana, who had come to work here from the very beginning, like a month ago. It pissed Michael off immensely. Right now, he was round in the eye. Why don't you check? Not enough. Okay, let's move on, grinned crooked Adriana. Following the chief's apron flew vest, but it, by the way, had no pockets. Do you think I have something interesting under my skirt too? Well, let's check it out together. The young beauty pulled the zipper down, grasped the waistband of the skirt with her fingers and pulled. An element of the uniform fell down, exposing slender legs in stockings, and what else they saw made them all gasp. Only Rick didn't see anything, because he was clamping his eyes shut, because he thought he was too decent a man to look at such a thing. But most shocked of all was Michael, who felt as if the ground were going out from under his feet, for many a calamity rivers of evidence. I didn't think I'd ever see it again. Adriana was born in the district center, around which exactly satellite. There were several villages, each boasting a rich history, and in the oldest of the villages, which was called Molokny, lived Adriana's grandparents on her mother's side. At them she spent every summer as a child, and sometimes on the winter another month. Their parents sent the children of the earliest years. Adriana, as a fairy tale remembered in the house at grandparents', and was a real Russian fairy tale. The stove, near which it was so cozy to sit. In cold, rainy, and studio evenings, when grandmother baked pies with jam or meat, told her granddaughter fairy tales. Grandmother knew so many fairy tales about the wise hare, who deceived the hunter about the magic carp, which helped the peasant to marry the Tsar's daughter. About children who got lost in the forest, and they almost ate Baba Yaga. But most of all liked the tales about the golden voice, who lived in Gori, kept their untold treasures. Stone and gemstones, whole blocks of silver and gold, scatterings of pearls. Only it is not so easy to hit the treasures of the strip. Mysteriously smiled, and said grandmother, only a brave man with a white soul will take them. Well, of course, many in the old days tried and thought up all sorts of tricks for this. They used to carry Polozov bread and honey and try to titillate him with songs and dances. And then long ago, one day Adriana jumped on the spot when grandmother began to tell about voices. She demanded more tales about him and liked those stories. How a merchant drowned a whole barge with him in the river to placate him, and how poor orphans found a necklace of treasure, and selling it saved their whole family from serfdom. But most of all, Adriana liked the tale of how Baron Michael decided one day that Mushichku, uneducated, it is a fool, but he'll get the treasure for sure. He would go with them from the wilderness to the capital and become a big man there. And the Tsarina herself would be able to kiss his hand in the morning. Michael was a stubborn, wicked, and cunning man, and he, having read books and diaries, the forbidden names of which cannot be uttered by a good man, decided that the treasures cannot be taken away so easily, but can only be exchanged. So one day Michael single-handedly harnessed a cart and set out for the foothills of the mountains. Golden voice, he shouted when he arrived at the place. Come on out, bargain. Saying this, Michael drew a special sign on the ground, and then struck himself on the hand with a sickle and scarlet, and drops fell, soaked the ground, and the earth sang like 1,000 serpents. The wind ran through the grass as if someone big had stirred in it. Fear clawed at Michael's heart with icy claws. It was necessary to run, but his greed was stronger, and he, afraid to turn his back to the mountain, went to the cart, threw the rag in the cart, bound hand and foot. There lay a beautiful maiden, all Sophia. Only yesterday she had boldly approached the Baron to ask him for permission to marry the blacksmith. Michael said that it was really time for her to become a bride. The foolish girl was glad, thinking that the Baron was talking about the blacksmith. She didn't know that the Baron had planned for her a very different bridegroom. Not of the human race, not even for the idea of the sex I have. Michael shouted in a trembling voice, "Look, what a beauty! Eyes green like emeralds, blue scarlet like coral tresses, as if made of gold, and her teeth white as pearls. Her skin is like her neck." Michael, disregarding the squeak from under the clip, shielded the girl's rounded thighs with his hand, and her heart is hard to find. Thou hast a ruby as big as the heart beating in her bosom. Take it, Polos. Let us trade with thee. Standing in misery from the cart, Michael in his arms, carried to the thicket of grass and lowered to the ground. All around with good birds, even the wind, and then something grabbed the maiden and dragged her away into the widened deep that led into the bowels of the mountain. The Baron went back to the cart, sat down, pulled the horse's reins, and rode back without looking back. He returned with gray periods in his hair, with new wrinkles on his face, and gloomy, silent, locked himself in his chambers and opened to no one. Missing. The girls, of course, noticed, but the Baron told everyone that the fool must have run away and been caught by wolves or a bear. The serfs, though, said all sorts of things, but who would dare to say openly what they thought? And then 2 moons from the day Michael made an offering as at the mine, which belonged to Michael's family and which everyone thought was worked out, suddenly discovered deposits of all kinds of silver malachite and even colored stones. Michael became a rich man in an instant. He really went to the capital. There he found himself a noblewoman's wife, noble and rich. And then, when she walked and boasted how he returned to the estate and lived as if in a fairy tale. True, it soon became clear that his wife can't stand him. She had married out of her parents' will, but the union was not infertile. A daughter was born, and they named her Betty. And how handsome was she! She grew white ruddy hair as white as flame, as red as gold, and eyes as gray as thunder dots. The time came, and Betty was betrothed, hitched to a young landowner from a neighboring estate. Michael had no heart for his only daughter, and was terribly proud that his little girl was marrying for love. On the night before the wedding, Michael woke up as if from a jolt, and he suddenly wanted to look at his daughter, to admire her right now, when she would leave her parents' house and become a wife. The Baron lit a candle and entered the maiden's room. He would have cried out in terror, but the nightmare was so wild that it did not stir above the bed. Betty stood something, and at first one might have decided that it was a man as white as the moon on his face and with hair black, which like a torrent of dark river water did not match to the floor. He was dressed in black and gold robes, and on each hand he had only 4 fingers with long, sharp claws, and on each finger was a ring, gems upon gems. Only he wasn't human after all, because his eyes were yellow and had no glasses, and his teeth were sharp, with a twin long snake's tongue slithering between them. Also a snake's tail could be seen from beneath the rich man's robes. Hissed the night visitor, unbound. A golden stripe. Michael recognized him instantly. What do you want? Guess. The monster grinned, and his hands reached for sleeping Betty. You've shown me what true treasure can be, and now I want more. No. Michael dropped to his knees, reaching into both hands. Not her. Take any other serf girl I can give you, and if you want, I'll get some noblemen to come. They will come with their daughters, and you can have any of them. My daughter was spared, and you're still as greedy and hardy as ever. You see, you'd buy any other's daughter to keep your own. No. I like your pearl, though. Now she'll be my bride. And the floor easily took Sleeping Beauty under his arms. Is there nothing I can do to change your mind? Shook with sobs, the lingering father. Do you know? Betty said thoughtfully, can I have Siberia back? She had fun with it, and bring it back in 12 years. In the meantime, be a friend, and make sure that I'm fed and satisfied. As whispered, ready for anything, Michael. Tell the people that now I need brides. Let them bring beautiful girls, and I'll exchange them for stones, cold for gold without a word, and what you people value more than the lives of your kind. Saying this, Betty stepped, vanished into the darkness of the night with Betty. Of course, there was a lot of commotion when the bartender's daughter disappeared, and Michael had become quite glum. His wife, unable to bear his grief, soon faded away. The estate was falling into disrepair. Michael began to sing. Years flew by. He was completely ruined, and those around him now knew him as a crazy baron who went mad from the loss of his daughter and wife. But Michael was not a quiet, crazy man at all. He would tell everyone he saw about the treasure that could be taken from the golden pole. People would twiddle their thumbs, of course, but Michael talked and talked. How angry was he with the world? The 12 promised years flew by. The day came when Betty was stolen by the master of the mountain. But Michael didn't go to grief. He suddenly realized that he couldn't stand it because, well, he would get Betty back. And then what? Who will need his daughter so unfortunate and disgraced? No one would marry her like that, and everyone would point the finger at them. The whole family will be disgraced. Damn it to hell. My daughter. Michael repeated like an incantation over a bottle of vodka, which he drank more often than bread. And then the Baron died. He just didn't wake up in the morning. And over time, the story was forgotten. It remained only in the legends the old men told, turned into a fairy tale. Little Adriana, when she returned to her parents in the district center, she naturally shared with him how she spent her time in the village. Her parents listened to her. Only her grandmother's fairy tales her mother did not like to listen to and told her to listen to them. She told her daughter not to pay attention to them at all. Once Adriana's mother took up her belt when the little girl started to tell her daughter a story about vines in kindergarten. "They're completely crazy," shouted at her father, Adriana Benjamin. "You don't understand. These fairy tales have ruined more than one life. You can't talk about such things," replied Mom. "That's the same village," sighed then father, and promised his daughter that no longer an offense will not give her. Benjamin worked on TV, and Mom worked at a kiosk at the bus stop. They didn't have enough money to live on. And one day my father decided that he would work in the mines in the neighboring region. In general, a friend recommended this option to him in order to go to this place. My father quickly learned to be a builder. He learned to do the simplest things. So the family's income increased, but the problems increased, because now it turned out that almost all the time there were no adults at home. Someone had to look after Adriana. Sometimes a neighbor could help, but she didn't always have that option. In general, although there was more money, there were still problems in life. Adriana's mom was stressed now. She had no time for anything. Everything was falling out of her hands. And Adriana, who had already gone to school, began to study very badly. And teachers, and even the headmaster himself, hinted so transparent her parents that they are also to blame. They should take better care of their daughter. And then Adriana's parents decided why not send their daughter to the village. Let her grandparents raise her there. They'll probably do just as well, and they'll make money. And they would visit their daughter, of course, and take her for weekends. And then they decided that maybe they could do it even if they saved up well. Even from a rented apartment to their own, if they could get a loan. To Benjamin's parents, who could theoretically support them and their daughter. But in practice it was impossible, because Benjamin's mother had long since remarried and came far away. And the father himself was in need of help, suffering from a bouquet of serious illnesses, and lived in a family of distant relatives. In general, there were not many options to deal with the situation. Adriana herself was very happy to return to the village. She had friends here, and she soon got used to school. Her grandparents took good care of her. Not much in the way of housework. Should I burden her? Take care of your hands, her grandmother used to say to her sometimes, when Adriana was going to weed cheesecakes in the vegetable garden or do some other dirty work. Let your hands be white and soft as silk. Will you be a bride? In the evenings, grandmothers, often with 1 July in front of a large and antique in a carved frame and mirror, and comb her long hair, singing songs and very beautiful voice, from which the granddaughter always soon began to sleep. You're growing up beautiful. You will soon be a bride to your grandmother. This was very often repeated, and Adriana, who was already a teenager, embarrassed, giggled, and joked that she might get married at 40 years old. She wants to study first, build a career, and travel the world. Grandma, who's that? Adriana asked one day. She and her grandmother were sitting on the couch looking at a photo album. She was very interested in one photo. which was unusual. It turned out, for whatever reason, to be tucked under another picture. Both pictures were taken, it seems, at about the same time. Even the compositions of all the participants were the same on them, but almost all of them. In the first top photo, the grandmother was captured as a very young girl, about 7 years old she was. She stood with her eyes wide open and looking into the camera. Behind her back stood an old man and an old lady. Adriana knew who this grandmother and her grandmother's grandfather were. That is, they came from her great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather. In the second picture were the same people, but there was still present a young girl who had a similar face to her grandmother when she was young. It gave the impression that it was the same photo. It's just that on the second, it's an unknown girl has removed edit the photo. My older sister answered my grandmother after a long pause. Sister, and I didn't know that Mom was Auntie. What was her name? Where do we live? Oh, I'm sorry, Adriana. I thought the question might have been unfortunate. I mean, she'd never heard of this sister. She'd never seen her before. And maybe it was because of some tragic family history. As a matter of fact, it was. Only Adriana did not yet know how tragic it was, and did not see that the very essence of this story is like the roots of a mighty tree, which can spread far away from the trunk of the crown, affecting a lot of land around. But the grandmother would not tell anything. Only grumbled that enough. Say, enough to look at the photo. We should go to the text and put the pies. Adriana only shrugged her shoulders. To know about distant relatives would be interesting. But Adriana was 16 years old and had her hands full with her own affairs and worries to keep her head full of it for long. She'd finished another grade, waiting as she always did for her dad and mom to come and pick her up for the weekend, and even for a whole vacation they'd spend together, as they always did in the city. In the meantime, while waiting for that to happen, Adriana was enjoying the first few days of school vacation, and to her amazement, watched the relationship between her grandparents deteriorate. They often quarreled. What's wrong? Adriana asked him or her. Nothing, answered her grandmother. Never mind, everything is fine, Grandpa replied. They also often argued heatedly, but always fell silent. As soon as Adriana was nearby, Grandmother often drank heart drops, and Adriana could hear it at night. Grandma cried a lot and kept repeating the same name, Kathy. One day, Grandma dared to talk to Adriana. Grandma, I can't take it anymore. What's going on? One of you is seriously ill, and you don't know how to tell me. And who is Kathy? Christina first looked at her granddaughter like a ghost, then cried again, but then wiped her tears with a handkerchief and invited her to sit down next to her. It's just that Grandpa says you don't need to know all this. He says that maybe it will go away, maybe it will never come back. It's a disaster in our house. I can't take it anymore, granddaughter. Do you have to know that? If we're going to save my dear face, it's better for you to know, so you'll be careful. I'll tell you everything as it is. He's talking. It all happened when she was just a girl. The world was a very different place then. It was the end of the 30s and the village was going through hard times. There was a man called William who ran the place. He was a strict, even cruel man, used to doing things his own way. William came from the poorest strata of the population, as they say, and he couldn't stand those who were left of the old world. And so it was fate and chance that William became chairman of the collective farm. And in fact, people expected the worst from him. But it turned out that there were positive sides to this man. He was hardworking and giving others hard work himself to take on twice as much. He did not drink and did not even smoke. He strictly monitored that the Kolko's good flourished. And little by little people began to warm to William. They began to say that with such a leadership the village would go far in the sense that it would show everyone. Record harvests, high milk yields, and all that. William, by the way, was a family man. He had a wife and a daughter. William adored the latter more than anything else in the world. People used to joke that she was more valuable to him than the collective farm, and lived then in the power of Marlowe very well all. But suddenly everything changed. 2 years of crop failure, the fall of cattle, and on top of that, not before the delivery of the Kolkhoz property, were found in such volumes that everyone became frightened. But as if these troubles were not enough, only William lost his family. It happened when his daughter and his wife went berrying in the forest for blueberries. People couldn't understand why they took a bitter turn, where all the inhabitants of Soap Tea had never seen berries, but only found their car in the tall grasses. At first, people thought that the mother and daughter had fallen asleep while basking in the sun, but it turned out to be an eternal sleep. Naturally, the local paramedic and people from the city who came to this case wanted to understand what happened, and they found the answer. They said that a poisonous snake had bitten both vipers. Only the people of the town, Little T, were very surprised, because the snakes not poisonous unusual in the neighborhood had not seen long ago even the old-timers. William was crushed with grief. For the first time in his life, he reached for a drink, and there were some bastards who gave him a drink willingly. Obviously, there's only one man left in the world. We can spoil him now. For vodka, William began to take out of the house everything that could be sold. Over time, his hands came to the point of dismantling the trunk that had been inherited from his great-grandfather. William in life are not attracted to him, so kept and out of respect for the memory of ancestors, but now began to dig there. Maybe something valuable to sell ready to find. Old rags, turned to dust, wooden painted spoons, a couple of coins from the Tsarist era of kopecks. An old book, it was lying on the hut itself, and even under it. It turned out that there was a false one in the chest. What is this nonsense? What a marvel? William thought. Looking at the book, he did not understand the ancient language, but William's great-great-grandfather was a schoolteacher, and in his time did not spare in them neither nettles nor belt, and even sticks were not spared to beat in the head of his great-grandson any knowledge. And so William was able to make out what the book was about. This book was written in the 18th century, and it spoke of the abomination of the extreme, that is, of witchcraft. William, such nonsense. Even when I wasn't a believer, but now I'm no other way than a hangover. The thing was that the book talked about how you can bad away from a person or from the settlement of a whole, about how one could get great wealth. The plight of his native collective farm gave William no less peace than the death of his family. So he made up his mind. Soon the villagers noticed that William had changed. He still drank and became even more sullen, but he stopped locking himself up at home and went wandering towards the mountain more and more often. What was he doing there? Why was he wandering alone? People shrugged their shoulders and said that, apparently, the Russian had gone mad, and apparently there would soon be another chairman of the collective farm. And then one day William came to Bracker. Well, that is Christina's family. He had a long talk with its heads. Christina's grandparents are quite old, and the Brackers, by the way, were longtime debtors to William, because it was he who had once helped them avoid having the last Ukrainian woman taken away. And now, so to speak, it was time to return the favor. Zima was still small, and everyone thought she was a booger and didn't understand anything, but she did. And she was also able to be stealthy and quiet as a mouse, and therefore heard and understood much more. She learned what the adults thought would remain their secret, a dark, cruel secret. And so Christina overheard one day, sitting in the cellar. As above her talk Russian and old men that you can get untold riches and the pestilence of cattle. If you ask for help from the golden voice, only not empty-handed petitioner should go to him. One must present him with a treasure. Little Christina was so surprised that old people believe in fairy tales, and also that day when William said he would go to the lane, she quietly ran after him from the summer. William had already told everyone that day that he would go to the berry patch. William didn't go alone. Kathy was with him, and Christina's grandparents. People were surprised and overjoyed at the same time, thinking that he had apparently decided to return to normal life, that he had come to terms with the loss of his daughter and wife. People also said that William must have planned to marry Kathy, After all, it's no good for a man like that to be a widower until he's old. And people also reasoned that it was the right thing to do. Very right, because Kathy was a real disgrace to the Bracker family. She had to be fixed right away. She was too bold with her free will, saying that she would soon go to the city, and there she would live with a man for nothing. Because marriage is a bourgeois remnant. Then this Tom with the city students that came to the practice was confused and said even that she got pregnant from one, and then to grandmother Nera, who had the fame of a sorceress, ran to get rid of the pregnancy. With a tail, following the paths while the shock and her relatives went deeper into the forest, they entered it from the side of the mountain and walked for a very long time. Finally, the adults came to a clearing of the forest. Around stood Malachite Wall. It was very quiet here, and the birds were not singing. And in 2 steps darkened the foot of the mountain and no berries. What? Christina was surprised. There weren't any. Only trees here were very strange, with trunks feathers steeper on the ground. Grass was growing. Holias, countrywoman. She realized that the adults had come to the place where she was dying, calling her 7 years old. Christina was clever, and it must have been that cleverness, and also some ancient instinct that warned people of danger, that prevented her from screaming in fear and in comprehension of what she was watching. The fact was that William suddenly jumped on Kathy, hit her hard, and then tied her to a tree with a rope. Grandma and Grandpa just stood back and watched this. Kathy, naturally, lashed out, screaming, asking why was she being treated like this. "You're a disgrace," said the old lady. "She's not a granddaughter." "At least you'll do some good," said the old man. "Forgive us, granddaughter, but through your sacrifice, our whole village will be saved. All honest people will live well. We won't forget you," added the grandmother. "We will remember you with kind words and ways." William, meanwhile, was drawing some signs on the ground, muttering strange words, and then he lit a small fire and began to pound some powder into it. Strange smelling smoke. Kathy coughed. She was still twitching at her points, screaming, begging, crying, threatening to tell all the people the truth. But gradually it weakened and finally quieted down. William the same with the old men. And all this time stood aside. Where the smoke almost did not reach, they were clamped mouths, noses, rags to stink, more dramatic to breathe. And then the woman who was closest to her sister suddenly heard a noise from outside. There was a rumbling under the ground, as if a whole train was coming. Suddenly the ground shook, and then an animal howl rang out over the meadow, and then a wild, mad laughter. What beasts, what birds could be capable of that? Zinchenko was below dead with fear, and she would have snapped, rushed away, but she could not leave her sister. She loved her sister very, very much. In an instant, she forgot how Kathy had patted her with a towel for Christina dragging her lipstick and spilling her perfume. She had forgotten how Kathy had thrown the housework on her, and how she herself had run away to a dance at the village club. Now all the strength, all the courage of a loner served but one purpose. She must save her sister. And then, following the sounds of wondrously no fairy tale monsters were capable of, came the movement of the grass, moving. There crawled a giant snake. William and the old men also saw and heard everything similar, for they suddenly shouted and were frightened and rushed away. And then Christina ventured out of her hiding place. The smoke had almost cleared already, but still she could barely see, barely breathe, ran up to the tree. Christina started to untangle the ropes. "Kathy, sweet Kathy, wake up." Tears came flooding down. Finally, the ropes lifted and her sister fell to her knees, coughing and vomiting. Little Kathy put her shoulder to her, and they staggered precisely crippled. The chortles moved from the glade away. There was a hill just beyond it, and the smoke didn't reach it nearly as far. There was also a stream running through there. Christina and Kathy fell down in front of it and began to drink the icy water greedily and looked at their faces with it. "Thank you," Kathy whispered hoarsely. "Kathy, why are they sodding like that?" asked Christina. I don't know, shook her head Kathy. I'm going to the city, run away, start a new life. I'll come with you, volunteered Christina, clinging to her sister. You won't. Kathy sighed. She stroked her sister's head. Your mom and dad and grandpa are mean. It wasn't until Christina was older that she realized why Kathy couldn't take Kathy with her back then. There was a girl missing, an 18-year-old runaway. It's bad enough, but it's still a tolerable event. If a child goes missing, then everyone will be out looking for her. You can't go far. Besides, despite the fact that the eldest of the family had clearly gone mad, joining William, who had gone mad. But there was still Mom and Dad, Liam and Vanessa. Liam was a tractor driver, and in the coming weeks he was going to take the family, move to the neighboring state farm in the village of Kalina. Vanessa was to get a job as a school teacher there as well. Kathy realized that of course her parents were needed. They loved her, adored her. They would take care of her. She, well, what's the sin, had been so herself that the people who could have been family to her fully, they drifted away. So now how could she run to them for help? And besides, Kathy realized that if she went and told everyone that William had done this to her, where's the guarantee that there's such a reputation for being a slutty and bad girl that anyone would believe it? Yes. And then there's the possibility of revenge for the truth being revealed. And wouldn't that revenge affect Sina and her parents? And Kathy made a decision. Christina, she looked her little sister in the eye. Let's get serious. You're a big girl. You saved me, and you want me to be okay. Then listen, Kathy spent a long time explaining some very important things to her little sister. And then they stood up from the ground, hugged each other tightly, and said goodbye. But before they separated in different directions, they looked together in the direction where the mountains towered and where over the clearing, whether the smoke was still increasing or the fog, what kind of fog was running. Do you see? Kathy asked suddenly, and more tightly, clutching her shoulder, nestled against her sister's. She whispered to Christina. Down there, they suddenly imagined that from the shadows of the forest appeared a human figure of a man, black hair, dressed in a long hollow kaftan black with gold embroidery, appeared for a moment, flashed yellow eyes, and disappeared. Had you imagined it? Said Kathy, and Christina nodded. I agree with her completely. Back home, Christina packed up what she wanted for the river, finished in the sunshine, and fell asleep. Overslept. That's why she was gone so long. I think they believed her. Only her grandfather and grandmother looked suspiciously, but the loner didn't give anything away. Then, of course, there was an uproar that everyone had left the forest without finding berries, and Kathy stayed behind, wanting to look for more. And then she disappeared. She was not found by Christina's parents, and many villagers, who were still kind to the girl, cried, deciding that she was lost when she wandered into the swamp where the beast got a tooth. And only once the grandfather and grandmother exchanged a quiet phrase between themselves about the fact that, apparently, he also accepted the offerings in the form of the girl's body. Much later, looking back on her life, Christina realized exactly the day when the fate of her older sister was decided. She had grown up abruptly, and life went on. Vanessa and Liam moved to another village with their daughter. Sometimes they went to visit their elderly parents, grandparents from the winter. By the way, in the same winter went away one by one, fever took down and carried away. By the way, the kolkhoz business began to improve. The cattle got better, milk yields increased, and the next year's harvest was unprecedented. William, however, was not even happy about it all, because he got drunk again, and eventually he was thrown out of the chairman's post. And then he moved from the village to the city to a distant relative, and died there soon after. Christina, by the way, was nearby. Her parents had just returned to stay with their relatives, when the neighbors were clearing out his house. But as she realized, they hadn't found the black book of witchcraft that Marlowe used to read the spell in the woods. It was gone. Christina was 10 years old when she suddenly received a letter. The envelope had a name she didn't recognize, and the letter came from Kamchatka. She was surprised and thought there was a mistake, but it turned out to be a letter Kathy had written in it. She reported that she was doing well, that she had finished technical school as a seamstress, got married a good man, and even they had a child already. Kathy thanked her little sister for saving her and told her to burn the letter after reading it for safety and to keep it secret. Kathy promised that she would still write occasionally. And so far throughout their lives, the sisters did exchange letters. When Adriana heard the whole story, she was shocked because it all seemed completely unbelievable, fabulously crazy, except that Baba Cristina was a materialist. She didn't even believe in omens with empty buckets and other trivialities of village folklore, and it didn't look like she was fantasizing. In her old age, born of reason, "Grandma, why did you tell me all this?" Adriana asked. "Evil, granddaughter, but time has no control over these things. Well, my face is what you need to know." And Cristina spoke again. When she grew up, she had time to study, to marry, to divorce, to remarry, to give birth to a daughter. That is, Adriana's mother. A man suddenly came to the village where Cristina lived. He came from the city and seemed to be an unremarkable character. Few town people come to breathe fresh air and drink milk, except that his surname, as I heard accidentally in a conversation in the car, in line for bread, so cut on the ears concussion. And then this Marlowe once visited the library, where Cristina worked, and started a conversation with her. And she almost sat up from what he said. This man turned out to be not only a relative of this William Marlowe, but also a man to whom William had confided her secrets on the eve of her death, and he began to ask Zina if she knew what had happened to Kathy. William was tormented. His conscience was bothering him. With courtly sympathy, Jack said, "He had nightmares. My sister disappeared when she went berry picking in the woods." Zenith managed by some miracle to stay calm outwardly. And if what William said was true, then he'd be in trouble. He didn't get much for that in his lifetime. But Jack persisted. He told that William in a dream was the Golden Polos himself, and he accused William that he asked for fortune for his native land and could not bring normal sacrifices. And do you know what the most interesting thing is? Jack continued. He took a handkerchief out of his pocket, unfolded it, and placed it on the table in front of Zina. Cristina was a simple woman, and all sorts of jewels of life did not see, but immediately realized that it is not glass in front of her. They are the very treasure, the bowels of the earth, gems that were mined in these parts long ago. "I'm a geologist by trade," Jack said. "And you know what's curious? Everything says there's nothing else of value in these mountains. But then how come I found this near that clearing William told me about? Why?" Cristina's voice trembled at last. "Why are you showing me all this? Why are you telling me?" "No reason," Jack grinned. "Maybe we could help each other." "I don't know what you mean." It didn't get scary. A noisy group of school children came through the library door. They'd come to turn in the books they'd borrowed for summer reading. "I'm busy," I put a sternness in my son's voice. "And you, citizen, apparently, should drink less vodka and not wander too much in your forests. They say there are poisonous vapors in the swamps, and they say they can give you a headache." "What is it?" Jack squinted. He was no longer trying to look friendly. "How do you want it?" I replied, suggesting that the two of us split the brain. Why didn't Kathy come forward? Why didn't she reveal the ugly truth? Growing up, Cristina wondered about that more than once. Maybe it was because her sister wanted to leave the family long ago, and there was such an occasion. If it wasn't for luck, as they say, how could she have known? It wasn't Grandpa and Grandma or William who were up to any more mischief. Was she really so sure that old people loved and harmed Liam and Vanessa's little sister? It was probably also coming to conclusions in Cristina's mind that Kathy was still afraid of not being believed. She might just be told she was crazy to talk like that. And then she would probably be in a danger that she might not be able to avoid. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Cristina, about this mysterious Jack, and she couldn't get her head around it. Here's the thing. Okay, William, from vodka to losing his wife and child. He's insane. But how could a city-educated man come to believe in the same creepy streak? And how far was he willing to go? Christina no longer knew what to expect. She waited that there would appear in their neighborhood geologists who would begin to develop the bowels of the earth. She even expected that people would suddenly talk about the disappearance of some young girl, but neither of these things happened. And Jack never showed up again. And life went on as before, nice and quiet. Her daughter grew up. The world changed. So all that was left to do was move and guess at the coffee grounds. What would happen next? It was painful for Christina to watch her native land change in the 90s. She disliked those who were called New Russians, and was glad that at least they did not go to them, did not build all sorts of businessmen, suspicious of their cottages here. Time flew by. A new 1,000 years came. And one day, Christina realized that in body she had grown old, but with her mind she was still young. It was such a contradiction that it was frustrating. Christina loved her daughter very much, but even more loved her granddaughter, Adriana. This girl seemed to be her own reflection from the distant past. And then the past appeared as a heavy, dark ghost. And it all started when the town folk came to the village. And all right, they were just people, but chief among them was a Russian named Ethan. Christina first encountered him when she was leaving the post office to collect her pension and almost got under the wheels of a jeep. The car braked with an ugly squeal. The door swung open and a man in a suit and shoes, and strange things jumped out, fussed, and held out his hand to help me stand up. He apologized and then introduced himself. "You must be Christina." He smiled, showing off his gold teeth. The two front ones had been replaced by them. That's when the old lady's heart sank into her heels. How did he know her? He'd never seen her before in his life. "Oh, it's not for nothing. But I've heard from you." He smiled at her like old friends and held her hand tightly. "Oh, like breaking an old lady's bones. Though they say you're the best expert on the history of this area." Christina exhaled. Could she be wrong? Because she seemed to understand what the man was talking about. The thing is that for about 15 years, Christina had been moonlighting as a tour guide, because in the surrounding villages and in the district center, there were a lot of all sorts of architectural monuments, museums as many as 2, and even fascinating natural beauty. And Christina on hunting was already at the age of a pensioner, but she loved life. She was eager for all kinds of activity. And so she found an outlet for herself. She worked as a tour guide for tourists, in general. At first, younger colleagues from several tourist bureaus laughed at her. They said, "We're old women to meddle in this field," but then quieted down because Christina a lot of interesting, not banal, could tell about the history of culture, native, places, and each tour with her was not like the previous one. That is, she already known spoke and fresh new added. But she told a joke with a busy fact, so that many people were on her excursions even repeatedly. In general, there was such an activity for Christina's soul, and a boost to her pension, of course. Christina tried to reassure herself that there aren't many people named Marlowe. And even if he is related to that Jack, so what? Maybe, and really in front of her, a person fascinating, educated. Ethan, by the way, as it turned out, really turned out to be a relative of Jack and straight. He was his son. Ethan said that he was a businessman, the owner of several jewelry salons, and would like to get acquainted with the works of local masters of malachite and sematsfeti, who created back in the days of serfdom. "We have such a thing," Christina said. "I have such a permanent exposition in the museum in the district center. True, the entrance there is not free, but by appointment of an individual tour for a small group. There can be up to 10 people. I'd love to say if you'll take me." Dear Christina smiled at Ethan. The sun glinted, and on his golden teeth the old woman had a jest of association. Like a beast insulted, ravenous, implying that he was planning to hunt, and so just after this meeting told Christina the story of her family, granddaughter Adriana. "You should know how dangerous. Maybe any man who bears the surname Marlowe." Apparently, Some knowledge of the secret William passed on to them. Perhaps they will not go to what their ancestor dared, or perhaps all their madness. Greed, ruthlessness struck, and Adriana listened to her grandmother very carefully. She was shocked by the story, which was like the script of a Hollywood thriller. But Adriana was also a teenager, and so she was inclined to look at the world in a special way with faith in the best, with the certainty that whatever horror was going on there, it would not affect her. And she also decided that all the terrible things happened a long time ago. And nowadays, who would believe in a creature that was half snake and half man? Leading a warrior with a proud treasure. That's ridiculous. It's just nonsense. So Adriana promised her grandmother she'd be very careful. But she quickly put it all out of her mind. She was so young, and she had her own worries. One of the next days, Adriana's grandparents went into town. They had to go to the hospital for their annual checkup. They were going to go through many doctors in a day. Adriana refused to go with them. "What should I do?" she asked, sitting in the clinic all day. Adriana decided that she would stay at home and prepare dinner for the old people's return. She also exercises her modeling gait. Yes, Adriana dreamed that after graduation she would not go to university, but become a top model. And she was, by the way, offended that adults laugh at her dream. They say, no, it won't work, so they don't decide anything for her. And just as the time was getting past 12 o'clock, there was a knock on the door. Adriana thought that it was her old people who came back early and opened the door without even asking who it was, and Ethan himself was behind the threshold. And in the first few moments of their meeting, Adriana was struck with a sense of danger like lightning. "Good afternoon," Ethan said. He asked politely for Christina. The girl replied that she was not at home. "That's a shame, and I so needed to talk to her." "About what?" "Maybe something to tell her." "Not much tea, and Kalina." "I wanted to ask you to clarify something," Ethan said. "It's just that I'm going out of town on a beauty pageant." Really, Adriana is roundly classy. She didn't realize she'd just taken the bait like a stupid pawn. "Do you have a daughter in the pageant?" "I, unfortunately, don't have a daughter yet, or even a wife." Ethan sighed. He had a knack for talking, almost like a hypnotist. And here he had already surrounded the girl with the web he needed. Mole, the rhythm of life of a successful businessman does not leave time to find a worthy girlfriend of life. And at the contest he acts as sponsors, as a member of the jury. Adriana could not resist and said that she dreams of becoming a model. Ethan asked why then he and her name. The heart of the list of contestants in this competition has not seen. After all, it is such a great opportunity to start a modeling career. Adriana replied embarrassed that she sent a questionnaire, but it was rejected because the participation is 17 years old, only she is 16. What nonsense. I will personally talk to the organizer, I think. He took her hand and kissed it. He'll make an exception for such a nymph, but it would be better to show up in person, of course. After all, today is the preliminaries for the finals. Adriana was thrilled. She believed that thanks to the patronage of an influential man, she would be allowed to enter the finals even after passing the previous stage. She said she'd be there in a jiffy. Just a jean jacket on the street of noticeably cold July from the village to the car, and a jeep with tinted windows drove from the village. He turned off the main road and onto a side road that didn't lead to the city, but was lost somewhere behind the mountain. Ethan had already thought it over. He decided that he would say that the girl in the middle of the road had asked him to drop her off. And for that he even threw Adriana's purse out of the window at some point in the field. Let them find it. Follow a false trail. And the girl was already lying by the clutch at that moment. In the backseat of his car, the victim was almost ready. If someone 15 years ago, Michael said that he would become a restaurant manager, he would only have laughed. Because, well, what kind of career in the restaurant, if he is the maximum that knows how to fry eggs, and fish fork from fork desserts cannot distinguish? No. Michael from a young age was accustomed to the fact that he was to continue so to speak, the family dynasty of doctors, psychiatrists. True, he had no special inclination to the science of human marasmus. But when you are indoctrinated from childhood that you must, in general, by the end of school everything was clear, and the university was appropriate supervision. Father, by the way, slightly violating the doctor's ethics, told a lot about his patients, considering it a kind of training for easy entry into the profession. Noah talked about it so often that Michael even began to fear that one day he himself would go crazy. Actually, then he thought for the first time that maybe, what it is, if Michael had nightmares, he thought that maybe they were signs of some kind of disorder. And if he forgot his phone at home, wouldn't that be a sign of dementia at an early age? Anyway, the guy was a nervous wreck. Noah was suggesting sedatives or snapping at his psychos. Michael, I'm normal. Soon the fear of one day becoming crazy myself became something routine and habitual, sort of chronic, but still lumber. You know, son, one day my mom said to Michael, you would now, before the first session starts, go on vacation, go to my brother. Mom's brother's name was Jacob. He lived in the South, ran a cafe in a resort town. Michael agreed lukewarmly. Why not? He didn't mind doing nothing before diving headfirst into his studies. It was there on the Black Sea coast that a dramatic change happened to him. Just one day, Jacob asked for help in the kitchen. The cook alone is sick, but I don't know how. Michael stepped in himself. Why can't you peel potatoes? Raised his eyebrows uncle. The first day she, however, only peeled potatoes and chopped mushrooms. But on the second day, Jacob told him to put less cream sauce on the stove, and then taught him how to shape and marinate fish. And by the time the real cook came home from sick leave, Michael was already in. Now he knew what he wanted to do with his life. Naturally, at home did not do without a scandal. Mom cried. Dad threatened to kick her out of the house and insinuated that someone was hysterical. For me, what's a lady's diagnosis from the 19th century? Michael snapped with a chuckle. Dad, I don't want to fight. Just realize that each person has his own way in life. How you talk, Noah said, but they made up. Of course, there were more attempts to talk, but in the end, the family accepted Michael's choice. And Michael, purely out of respect for his father, did not turn his back on psychiatry. And he and his parents talked about it a lot. His father shared with him news from the world, science, medicine from his field, and also sometimes told stories about patients. And one story especially touched Michael. It turned out that once his father, together with other psychiatrists, had to treat one curious patient. He was a respectable businessman. They say such people are the cream of society, but he suddenly shocked everyone by attacking a girl. Can you believe it? They had a family history of schizophrenia and suspected schizophrenia. And even though it's not scientifically proven to be hereditary, and there are versions of it, my father's story is full of gruesome details that this businessman, on the verge of bankruptcy, suddenly decided to turn to an old family legend that you can get untold riches through one mystical creature, namely the legendary golden voice, which supposedly keeps in the mountains of treasure deposits of precious stones. And okay, you're just a mystic, man. So he decided that sacrifice was the way to go. So he kidnapped the girl, took her to the woods at the foot of the mountain. And there, in general, the poor girl would have died. Probably, if only it had not happened in the same place to pass a company of mushroomers. They spooked the maniac. Look what I'll show you, said Father Michael. Well, I'm actually drinking tea. Pitifully stretched then, not yet far from the manager of the restaurant, and put aside the sausage sandwich. Father shoved a photograph under his nose. In general, this homegrown sorcerer decided that the symbols of sex appeal should not be carved on the ground. In general, many girls served as a kind of whip for Moldavian charms. A mushroom picker filmed it, thinking to sell the story to journalists. No, of course, people sometimes amaze me. Fortunately, he didn't sell it, said Noah, but he gave you the photo, said Michael. For science, Noah almost took offense. I never showed it to anyone but you, by the way. It's evidence of that. Dad tapped the photo with his finger. How bizarrely other people's minds can be twisted. I can't even begin to imagine what the poor girl went through. How is he with sincere sympathy? Michael asked. She was a tough girl. Scars, of course, for life. I talked to her, by the way, and asked her about Ethan. You had to see the whole picture of his behavior, so to speak. She held on, then she has a mother, father, grandparents. All in all, there's family to support. That's important, son. Michael did not consider himself a particularly impressionable person, but this picture was firmly lodged in his brain. Sometimes he even had nightmares about it. The girl's body in the forest clearing her face, he could never make out. There is so that it could not be seen. In these dreams, Michael knew he had to confront something dark, cruel, but he could not move. All he could do was watch helplessly as the girl, whose face he still could not see, approached. Something nightmarish was coming. This day, by the way, when everything had gone so wrong at the restaurant, he had woken up again from that nightmare. And then Adriana drove him crazy. 21 years old, a part-time student at a teacher's college. Smart girl, so all right, neat, without bad habits and even words parasites in the speech is not. Never flirts with restaurant guests. In general, a kind of girl from the provinces who kept such a rare today purity of soul. Yes, Michael knew she came from some backwoods village to the city to study. Yes, she pissed him off. And it came out naturally. True, at first he was only covered with some vague anxiety when she appeared in sight, and he couldn't understand what was the matter. She was just an ordinary waitress, an ordinary girl. Well, maybe very pretty. I can't take that away from her, but why does he feel so weird around her? And then one day they got into a fight. Just one day, a poorly dressed old man came into the cafe. He sat down at the table, read the menu for a long time, flipping the pages with his finger, which every now and then caught the drool. Yes, the menu understood. Michael will go to throw away. And the shell-shaped chair is designer. By the way, the furniture will go to the dry cleaner. Then the old man ordered a glass of water and the cheapest dish. Administrator Molly approached the guest, who clearly did not meet the level of the institution, and tried to politely escort him out. And almost succeeded. But then Adriana flew up and it started. She stood up for the old man and said that she would pay for his lunch. And then she started talking to him. It turned out, by the way, that he wasn't homeless, just lost in the city. Luckily, the number of a relative was in his phone. Button came and picked up the old man. Michael later reprimanded Adriana for intervening. Another time, he did not like the fact that she snapped at a guest. This visitor, unlike the old man, was decent and actually came here a lot. It was a famous blogger. She made an unfortunate joke about Adriana not knowing the ingredient of a fancy dish. She said something and it just went viral. The blogger, by the way, promised to keep Atlas among her 1 million subscribers. But luckily, she didn't seem to follow through on that threat. Michael then spent a week monitoring her page. He looked at the scene before him and felt bad. It was like heaven and earth had changed places, like the room had run out of air. He just couldn't stop looking at those feet. Yeah, compared to the fresh, if you could call it that, picture, it looked better now. Neater. Such a definition for the fancy vase scars covering a woman's legs from her hips and almost to her knees was almost physical. The sensation was nauseating. Michael took a deep breath, then exhaled with a quiet, hoarse sound. It was her. Adriana turned out to be the same poor girl he yearned to save so many times in his nightmares. Adriana turned out to be the very victim he felt so genuinely sorry for. More than once in all these years, he had intended to go to his father and ask him how the village girl was doing. Couldn't he find out anything about her fate? Or maybe she needed some help. Michael never did. Why didn't he? Well, he felt like a complete idiot for intending to interfere in someone else's life. He probably shouldn't have gotten her story in the first place. And now? What? Now he knew everything. And what's more, Michael had never felt so disgusted with himself in his life. If he could just hit her harder, like she had done for him. I mean, she looked at him in such a way that if he could fall through the ground to that very lane, he would do it with great pleasure. Maybe that would atone for what he'd just done. I don't know. I don't think there's anything I can do about it. Adriana. Michael slipped his jacket off his shoulders and held it out to her. Don't, please don't, she asked. And the grin on her lips, and the grin that would have slapped him in front of everyone, honestly. I thought that's what you were after. So, did everybody see it? Did you enjoy the show? She didn't take his jacket. Instead, she pulled up his skirt, zipped it up. I quit. She spit it out, and you dashed out of the room. Heather, what kind of idiot am I? Michael paced his office and prepared to tear the hair out of his head. He missed the moment. He should have rushed right after Adriana, but he stood there with her apron in his hands like a complete moron. But he could only think of himself as an asshole now. And then, when he came to his senses and ran out after her, he realized he was too late. She had already changed, leaving her waitress uniform in the staff locker room, and gone. Where to? In principle, Michael quickly realized that the address of registration, residence, that is, the address of the student dormitory, you can find out if you look in the personnel department. But then what? He couldn't just go to her and say, I apologize for the awkward situation. By the way, I know you were almost killed by a crazed maniac a few years ago, and that's why I care about you in a weird way. Why don't we discuss this over coffee? The silverware that started it all. They went in almost as soon as Adriana left, by the way. Turns out they were accidentally dropped behind the buffet, in front of that staff. By the way, Michael was also very embarrassed about the scene he had made. Now they, naturally, had every reason to consider him a nutcase, an autocrat, a pervert. Perhaps rumors about this outrage will reach even the owner of the institution, and then he may even be fired. But it didn't matter anyway. In fact, it seemed like it couldn't get any worse. If only Michael knew that in this negative plan there are no limits and boundaries. From thinking and walking along the closed mini-route of a conditional animal in a cramped zoo cage, he was brought out by a knock on the door. I'm busy. Leave me alone. Michael bellowed. Sure, it's that bad. There was a voice that sounded very familiar. Michael opened the door with a jerk and almost fainted because the last person he expected to see was his uncle. Jacob exhaled. His nephew grinned into his grandfather's mustache. So this is my bad timing. You apologize for the unannounced visit. Just got off the train and straight here. I really wanted to surprise you and to see where you live. No, he shook his head. Michael finally fueled him up for the joy of meeting you. They hadn't seen each other in years. Somehow, life got a little crazy out there. Come on in, Jacob, come on in. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't expect it either. Uncle came into the office. Everything, you know, things are pulling in all directions. And then I thought, time goes on, life goes on. Why am I sitting here? My relatives. That's the most important thing. You can't do that. So I decided, and I flew off without me. It won't fall apart in a few days. But maybe I'm not in time after all. No, he ran his hand nervously through his hair. What makes you think that? You don't look like yourself, Jacob replied. While I was coming to you, the staff is following me as if the lion is hunting mice. What happened? Yeah, it happened. You wouldn't believe that you dropped Michael's head. No, I know life happens. So now Jacob was looking expectant. Ouch, nephew. Not only are you silent, as if you've already started to scold me for something, but you don't know how to receive guests. Not even offered tea. And what did I do for you? Only taught you. That's right. I'm sorry you're like this. Let's go to lunch and talk about it. That's a different conversation. Jacob smiled. Let's see what kind of inn this is. You run the place. They went into the hall, chose a free table, and sat down. Lisa brought the menu. Jacob asked her nephew's advice and ordered. That fateful summer for Michael when he realized what he wanted to do in life. He also gained another truly kind-hearted person. Jacob was the kind of interlocutor to whom you could pour out your soul, who will never rebuke the empty, but also pretend to agree with everything. If they didn't, they wouldn't. And now, when Michael had the opportunity to talk about everything, he immediately felt relief, as if he had thrown off his shoulders, surrounded by Stone's basket. He told Jacob all about Adriana and his attitude toward her. Jacob listened attentively without interrupting, and it seemed as if he were only listening while he was busy eating. Michael, who was well aware of the fact that his uncle never hurries to say important things. First, he thinks 3 times about what to say. He did not rush him. "Tell me, what am I to do now?" Michael sighed. Dessert was just being served. Molly curious about the voices. Michael flashed his eyes in response and waved his head, saying, "Shoo away, and you won't get any food for gossip." "You should go to her," Jacob replied. Just like that, Michael stretched out frustratedly, his face cupped in the palm of his hand with a groan. "Impossible. What kind of miracle recipe for solving all this did you expect me to give you?" He grinned. He looked very serious and even stroked. "You are still young, though not so young on the other hand. But since you asked for my opinion and advice, here it is. Sometimes the most complex issues are solved by the simplest method. It's like the bread recipe, nephew. Remember what I told you. You can bake it to be served to the king." Michael replied, "There is nothing like the ordinary bread that was baked in your ancestral home." I remember my uncle smiling sadly, talking about how sometimes the simplest things are the best, the most important, and the most needed. But what if she won't listen? "But she might listen," Jacob said, carefully scooping a forest of mango belts into a spoonful of bitter chocolate frosting. He tasted the dessert. It was original. There's nothing to say. It's delicious. But I'm not a dessert man. So I'm just saying it's delicious. Okay, Michael nodded. He felt better for the first time. "So I'm going to her place tomorrow." But it was a little more complicated than that, because first it was to the dormitory, where he showed up with a bouquet of roses. Michael decided that such an addition to a sincere apology would not be superfluous. He was told that Adriana had not been seen at all, but he was lucky. Her roommate was just passing by and told him that Adriana had packed up last night and was rushing to the train station to go home to her grandparents. Her dad and mom are there too. They decided to spend their vacation in the village. What should she do in the city? She shrugged her shoulders. She lost her job. By the way, do you know why? No. Michael barely got out of himself and blushed like a tomato because he didn't introduce himself in full form, that he was the manager of the very restaurant from which Adriana had quit. As he realized, Adriana hadn't told her roommate the details, just said goodbye to her. "I see." Stretched thoughtfully cast him a curious look. She, seeing the roses in his hands, decided that he was Adriana's suitor. "Anyway, I think she's in the village until the session starts. Soon to be a couple weeks and a tail. Why do you really want her?" "Very much, Michael. Have you lost your cell phone? Or she ignored you?" Raised her eyebrows meaningfully. "Believe me, it's complicated. Michael wasn't going to tell me everything." "And thank you very much," he thanked and walked away from the dormitory. The plan had changed. Now he had to call the owner of the restaurant, apologize and say that I had to miss a day of work. And he also had to stop by the house to pack his things, because Michael had decided that he was going to the village. He was going tomorrow. Adriana was already used to living in the city, and she realized that she would stay there after graduation. And there, if very lucky, then in the next 3 to 4 years will be able to take a mortgage. But still, the city with all its opportunities and joys could not overshadow her native village. That nightmare when she found herself on the walls. 6 eternity. Hours in the captivity of a maniac didn't just turn Adriana's life upside down, didn't just leave scars on her body. She had become a different person. Yes, outwardly she was a strong girl. She coped with everything. But she withdrew into herself, finished school with everyone smiling, visiting her in the hospital, relatives and friends. She repeated 100 times that the main thing was that she was alive, and the rest will come with it. But no one, not even those psychologists, psychiatrists, in conversations with whom Adriana spent so many hours, no one knew what was going on in her soul. Her moments of fear had caused Adriana to lose many of her perceptions of the world around her and of herself. She was glad when Teresa, in her monster in human form, was locked up, declared insane. But at times it still seemed to have power over her. Sometimes she had nightmarish dreams. In them, Adriana found herself at the foot of the mountain, helpless and clothed, for some reason in a snow-white bridesmaid's dress. In these, it was night, as always. And then someone who appeared out of the darkness grabbed her by the arm and dragged her into the unknown. Adriana fought back desperately in such dreams, but in the end she was still dragged into the darkness, and there she fell for an endless long time, and then always woke up at the end. And gradually Adriana began to accept the scary dreams as just an ordinary part of her life. And life went on. The young girl listened to the then wise advice, the grandmother of best friends, that it was better not to give interviews, not to let herself be photographed or videotaped, and that by doing so, her whole story would soon be forgotten. Adriana also pretty quickly refused to talk to a psychologist. He reasoned that now she herself, to her own taste, and also, of course, if it is convenient for work, can, so to speak, restore its potential of nerve cells, doing something on the go. She tried to paint, to write poetry, and to meditate, but it just didn't seem to work out. And in the end, she decided that it was enough, perhaps just to live another day, and then another, and another, and another, pretending, above all, to herself, that it was as if nothing had happened. What Adriana didn't have was a lot of thinking about why this was happening to her. Why did she deserve this from the universe? She accepted what had happened simply as fact. Yes, it had happened. Yes, it was a nightmare. But it was all just a coincidence. Granddaughter. Everything happens in life for a reason, her grandmother had once told her. Each event leads to another. That's how life works, like beads of pearls strung on a string. Adriana did not argue with what her grandmother said because she felt sorry for her, as well as for her grandfather. She was well aware of how much her old people, as well as her mother and father, had suffered back then, how much they had disturbed her. So why cloud her life with arguments with her relatives? That was Adriana's reasoning. It was easier. It made her life easier. But not everything was so simple and smooth. Adriana hardly dared admit it to herself. But since that fateful day, it was as if there were shards of the darkness that Ethan had been infected with, that he had obeyed. It was just that Adriana realized one day that it had hardened. It happened already after graduation, when she was 18 years old. She had just entered teacher's college then, and she had an affair with a handsome guy. And the affair, which is quite natural, at some point reached a very intimate stage of development. And that's when, in general, Adriana timidly said that she had one peculiarity. The guy said that it was nothing, that she was all beautiful to him. And then when he saw, "I'm sorry, I apologized," he hastily pulls up his pants. "I can't. You're starting to look like a scarecrow." The second man, with whom Adriana had almost reached intimacy at the sight of her scars, reacted as if calmer, but asked her to please turn off the lights and told her not to touch her body in that area with her hands because he was squeamish, and Adriana was just sick of it. She was just offended, and suddenly realized that since men need a perfect girl, since they are not ready to accept a flaw like that, it means that she will have to be alone perhaps for the rest of her life. So be it. And then Adriana, with one bow, deliberately did so. She accepted his advances, brought everything to the peak of romance. And then, already knowing what to expect, demonstrated her peculiarity. The bow didn't fail. He was horrified and ran away. And Adriana, in her imagination on men as a seal, put the underpants. They only want to be ideal. And if that's the case, it's better to be alone. And in fact, It was the understanding of what effect the sight of her disfigured legs produces that pushed Adriana to so easily undress at the first request of the restaurant manager. After all, she knew for certain that neither he nor anyone else present would be pleased by the sight. The girl did it driven by a spontaneous outburst of emotion, and at first it seemed to her that everything was right. Well, then it became sickening, and so Adriana decided that she had had enough. It was time to return to the village and spend with her grandparents and parents left behind in the neighboring one. The money not earned was a pity, of course, but she had some money set aside. And then during the sessions, Adriana knew for sure she would have the opportunity to work part-time with a tutor for the guys from the younger courses. She was very good in Russian language, literature, and social studies. She believed that she would become a good teacher in the future. As soon as Adriana stepped on the land where her native villages stood, she felt better. The girl enjoyed breathing in the clean air, what is not in the city air, and smiled. And for some reason it seemed that now everything would be fine. Only already approaching the village of Kalina, Michael thought about what he was doing. Suppose, he reasoned, Adriana had already told her family and friends what had happened. Then it was very likely that he would not be spoken to. He would be beaten. However, if, after a heart-to-heart, she agrees to listen to him, then he might be patient, and what other development is possible? The male Michael shuddered. He was shaken by the shoulder. The conductor is the ultimate. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he did not notice that they had already arrived from the bus. Time to get off. Apologizing and thanking for the reminder, Michael got off the bus. He had gotten so nervous on the way that he hadn't even bothered looking for a hotel. And not that Michael was stalling, but he started poking at his smartphone right away. The answer was simply predictable. No, there was an inn in the villages of Kalina and Silence. So Michael assumed he would have to go to the district center, but as the bus might not show up again today, which meant in his mind, Michael noted, he'd have to call an intercity cab. It's always available, just pay. And basically, the day was already slipping toward evening, so it would make more sense to go to the district center now and see Adriana fresh tomorrow. But ever since Michael had set foot on this land, the milk and Kalina had never left him. A strange, almost mystical feeling that he must not delay his visit. Yes, Dad. Distracted, Michael from his thoughts on the incoming call parents. They promised to call because Michael's mom was very worried about how her son got there. And in fact, Michael, not to tell his parents the full version of what happened so far, committed a bad deed by his own moral standards. He told them that he just went to visit a former classmate in another city. Yes, already in place, everything is fine, said Michael, taking the first steps from the bus stop forgotten. The narrow road was off the main road, and on both sides of it was densely overgrown with thistles, mugwort, and other weeds. I'm sorry, of course, but let's not do it now. Michael rolled his eyes, because it seemed that his father was going to give him a new portion of tales from his professional life. Michael froze in the next moments, because he heard a painfully familiar name. The father was passing on a fresh and acute news from the world of psychiatry. It turned out that Ethan Marlowe, of the very same Ethan Marlowe, who had been declared insane a few years ago, was now suddenly having an exacerbation. It seems that his relatives had oversight, and he had quit taking the pills he was supposed to take regularly and for the rest of his life, even after he was discharged from the clinic. And now Ethan was being searched for, because before he disappeared 2 days ago, he had painted all the walls, ceiling, and even the sheets on the bed in his room with dark shades of markers. Ethan was painting gold stripes with the talent of a madman. It's my fault. I was against letting him go home. I'd rather he was in the clinic. I mean, he's unpredictable. I don't know where he is right now, Father Michael muttered. Michael stopped, closed his eyes, and rubbed his nose tiredly. This is just awful. What are we going to do now? Well, the relatives are standing on their ears, trying to figure out what could have been on his mind. I mean, he barely spoke, but the last few days, he kept repeating himself. He kept saying he had to finish. But what did he want to finish? Father, Michael exclaimed. Michael sighed convulsively. This was the only problem he needed to deal with. And he also thought about the fact that Adriana, she certainly had a right and a need to know that this terrible man was now on the loose. And Michael jumped at the realization that was occurring to him. He seemed to have just realized what he was talking to a madwoman about, a self-proclaimed priest of the Golden Band, the dairy village of Kalina. He might be here to finish something. Think for yourself, Dad, what he has left unfinished business, Adriana girl. Yeah, I'd swear he wants to do what he was prevented from doing. Somebody always has to get here as soon as possible. In the meantime, I'll warn Adriana. Michael took a step further. Yes, he was terribly guilty. Adriana might be angry with him, but she would have to listen to him because she was in great danger. And Michael wanted to believe that he would not be late. He felt as if he'd been banging on the gate for ages, but in fact it was only a few minutes before they were opened. Evening. Good evening. Good evening. A certain old woman said hello, appraising him with a wary look. Electrician. No, Michael waved his head. I need to speak to Adriana. It's urgent. My granddaughter needs me. What is it about? The old woman wished thoughtfully with her lips on a personal matter. Tell me, please, Adriana, who is Bush at home? Landlady. Someone looked out of the house, an old man in a calfskin jacket. Michael realized that he wouldn't get a quick answer, but he didn't want to scare Adriana's elderly relatives, who had already lived through a nightmare in fear for her. Please, I need to talk to her right away. Hi. A young girl stood at the fence of a neighboring house. Looked like she'd just gotten back from a magic shop. She had a bag of groceries in her hand. You, Adriana, need some. So she went into the woods, waving the girl's free hand toward the right direction. She goes there a lot. Today on mushrooms only something was presented, added the neighbor. And with a tinge of excitement in her voice, Michael went cold. Only not that pierced the thought that Adriana, as by the will of an evil fate, itself deliberately goes into the claws of a predator. Or else he was exaggerating, and Ethan was still far away, and anything bad that might happen could be prevented. But Michael realized something else right now. There could be no more delay and no more hiding. And so he turned to Christina and said firmly, I must warn you. Ethan Marlowe is after Adriana. Christina gasped, pressed her palm to her mouth. Granddaughter, we need to find her as soon as possible, Michael said. What are you talking about? A young neighbor rounded her eyes. Isn't he in a mental institution? Not anymore. Michael shook his head. I'm afraid he might already be here. And that's why we really have to hurry. Someone had once told Adriana that after what had happened, fear would live in her heart forever. Not so. She still loved to walk in the woods of the river. Sometimes she'd go as far as the bogs and the cranberry steam. She had learned to breathe freely, not to squint at her own shadow, not to flinch at every rustle. The past belonged to the past, Adriana reasoned. Now she had to live in the present. Her hand was nicely pulled away, and the basket full of different mushrooms in her head was a lazy dot of bees' swirling thoughts. Yes, perhaps she had been a little overzealous when she'd flashed her bare legs and hips in front of so many people. However, since they were not strangers, in fact, strangers, they had probably forgotten about it. Adriana gave herself a mental kick and a slap on the wrist, reminding herself that now they should worry about other things, like how to successfully pass the session, where to get a new job, or rather a part-time job in the fall and winter. And then in that instant, when a man from her past suddenly appeared in front of her, Adriana didn't even immediately believe her eyes. She just stared at Ethan Marlowe, wide-eyed with a wide-open voice. Was it possible for him to appear to her, or, more accurately, after her, and in almost the exact same spot? Lips. The girls trembled, but no sound came out of them. I'm paralyzed with fear, Adriana thought. And then, apparently to keep from breaking down, her consciousness planted a joke in her mind. Just one day, a psychiatrist who counseled her, after all, had told her that she needed to work up the courage to face her fears. Face them. Oh well, Adriana thought. That seemed to be what was happening to her now. And then everything was happening too fast. Ethan's face had aged more outwardly than it really was. Years past distorted Simon threw himself at her. A basket of mushrooms fell. Adriana threw herself to run, but it was as if the forest was now against her. A dry snag fell under her foot. She got tangled up and fell. Here we meet. Sailed with anger, Ethan said. Yes, of course, I'm expecting you. That's all right. I've got my reward streak all to myself now. Adriana Barnacles. Wiggle stabbed and bit and resisted as best she could. But Ethan even out, apparently, and by his mental ailment, that weakened in his body was still much stronger. And then, after a few minutes of fiddling, when he had had enough of it all, he just struck Adriana hard several times on her face and head, and she lost her senses. The setting sun near the cinders of the mountain's edge. After the food, ruby gold rays were in Adriana's eyes as she slowly began to come to her senses. The girl coughed. Contributions of kin permeated the strange, as if full of honey and bitter meadow grasses. There was slashing and low breathing in her ears. What are you doing? Whispered. She tried to move, but not her arms, not her legs wouldn't obey. Ethan had not bound her, but she was completely helpless, could essentially only watch while he could act. His face was covered with rags, and Adriana guessed he was protecting her from the strange stupefaction of the beggar's smoke. He moved closer to her, and Adriana wanted to scream, but all that came out of her throat was a squeak no stronger than a mouse could squeak. Her mind was filled with thoughts and images. How similar everything was to what she had already experienced. At the same time, it was different. Details of Kathy's grandmother and sister's story surfaced in her mind. When her madman wanted to give her as a bride to the master of the mountain. There was a fire there too, and there was smoke. He must come, bring Ethan's voice to her. The man was held then at 6 and distressed by a coarse shiver, peered into the pendant at Harry's side, behind which appeared black gaffs. Either shadows lay among the piled stones, or they were passages in the cave, and Adriana didn't know for sure. Harry was a local boy, and he wanted adventure. They didn't want to be unkind to this place. Master of Mount Palace, come out. Ethan howled in a voice full of despair. He cried out to the legendary monster, begging him to help him regain his wealth, respect, and power. And in return, he begged for the gift of a young, beautiful girl. How long did it take? It must have been a long time, because the sun had almost had time to set, and now only the lights from the Keven of Light shone over the mountain. He can't hear you, Adriana said. She laughed nervously. How pathetic are you? You think that if he exists, he will condescend to someone like you. You're crazy. Well, that was definitely unnecessary. Only Adriana realized too late that she had ruined the madman, when he had already flung himself at her with his neck bowed low, sputtering saliva and hissing hoarsely. He accused Adriana of being some kind of wrong maiden, and if she was crawling squeamishly. Nothing. I guess the Lord of the Foothills doesn't want to come after you alive. Well, then, I'll send you to him. When Ethan's hand swept the girl on the ground, clutching something sharp, glittering steel, there was nothing she could have done and managed to turn away, to avoid the fatal blow. But at the same instant, those from the forest rushed toward them. And the next instant, the two men were rolling on the ground in a furious fight. Julia recognized Michael, and at first she thought it was just her imagination why he would show up here to help her. But it all seemed real. The men were striking each other. One or the other would suddenly find himself closer to what his opponent had been subjected to. And then, the media hissed and the grass rustled. That's what caught the attention of all three of them. They turned their heads, and Adriana's eyes rounded because there, in the shadows of the woods behind a shroud of smoke from the campfire that made her head spin, and as if sleep had taken over, she suddenly saw what appeared to her to be the figure of a man. He was tall, of black hair, and was in black gold, and his eyes were the eyes of a snake. "You don't exist," whispered Adriana. "I have come," whispered Evan. My master howled madly. Michael said nothing. His mind was now racing with a single thought. Had he gone mad? The figure of the golden floor, appearing as if from an ancient fairy tale, suddenly raised his hand, long fingers with sharp claws. At first pointing at the girl, but then shifted. And now they were pointing exactly at Ethan. I was confused. The madman said, "You're coming at me." "But why? I'm doing everything you want me to do." Michael already seemed that the arms of the band remained motionless, but the expression on his face changed. It was distorted with anger and contempt. Michael was so glad that what could not exist in the world by all the laws of nature was not angry at him. And then Ethan suddenly wheezed and clutched at his heart. Everything happened fast. Here he was just now pinning Michael to the ground, giving him a crushing blow. Here he is himself defeated, seemingly not even breathing anymore. "Adriana." Michael pushed his heavy body down, staggered, stammering toward the girl. He coughed from the smoke. "Adriana, we need to get away. Fresh air." "Falling for it," Adriana whispered. "No, he's gone." Michael rushed to keep looking in that direction, but with his side vision, he could see a tall, dark figure. "We're imagining it. He doesn't exist. He won't collect me," whispered Adriana again. Was she close to fainting? "Of course he wouldn't, and I'm not giving you to anyone. Do you hear me? Come on, get up." "Sorry, I can't carry her. We need some fresh air. Let's get out of here." Adriana finally gave in to the entreaties and with a quiet and pitiful tone, grabbed him by the shoulders and managed to stand up. He was gone. "Polos." "He was gone," she said. "He was gone," Michael said. Look. Adriana held Michael's hand stubbornly, and he gave in to her and looked where he had seen something that could not exist in the real world a few minutes earlier. The figure of the vine was no longer there, but it was in the grass. Michael saw it clearly. Some kind of large snake was crawling. An eel, viper, whatever. But it was enough for Michael's frozen mind to organize and logically explain what he saw. He decided that because of the smoke, which could have been poisonous plants, he had seen Harry's fairy tale host. It was just that he had seen an ordinary snake in reality. The realization from behind the smoke of fear for Adriana in the fight drew the rest. That's all. Everything has another explanation, he repeated to himself logically. Soon Michael and Adriana were found by people who rushed to rescue the girl. Just Michael, when they entered the forest, missed them. He turned aside, guided by some strange premonition that this was the right way. Michael and Adriana did not yet know that this event would be the starting point after which their lives would change forever. Intertwined, Michael apologized to Adriana. She managed to forgive him with all her soul. Ethan, by the way, turned out to be alive, but 2 days later he passed away in the clinic, and to the last he felt that the Golden Polos was angry with him. "It's all over now," Christina said with confidence when she learned of Ethan's death. Adriana's grandmother also said she could feel it in her heart. No more madwoman will be found who can believe in tales of the golden voice. But the story with the Master of the Mountain magically got an unexpected continuation. The thing was that when Adriana was returning home, she found a pebble in her sneakers, a common occurrence. Sure, if you get sap in your shoe. Only it was a small green pebble in a sparkling shard of glass. "I think it's an emerald," Grandma said knowingly. "What shall we do?" "We'll have a granddaughter." "I don't need it," Adriana shrugged. And that same day, going to the river, threw it into the water. It was a piece of glass, she said when she got home. And Christina pretended to believe it. Adriana, despite the excitement and even the renewed media attention, still went to the city for a session. Then she graduated. And immediately after graduation, the girl married Michael, with whom she had an affair a long time ago. As she now knew back in the day when he saved her from the crazy Ethan. and maybe from the golden canvas itself.